January 7, 1945. The frozen air of Belgium carried the distant echo of artillery fire as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before a gathering of war correspondents at his headquarters near Zonhoven. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate winter gamble, was waning, and the snow outside still bore the dark stains of what had been, in the Field Marshal's own estimation, the most interesting battle he had ever fought. Inside the briefing room, Montgomery's voice was confident, measured, deliberate. He spoke without notes for nearly an hour, his words crafted like a military operation itself. The reporters scribbled furiously. They did not yet understand that they were witnessing the verbal equivalent of a grenade being rolled into the heart of the Anglo-American alliance. Within hours, Montgomery's words would travel across the Atlantic and ignite a firestorm that would force Winston Churchill himself to rise in Parliament and do something he rarely did: publicly rebuke a British military hero to save an alliance upon which the fate of civilization itself depended. The seeds of this crisis had been planted long before that January press conference, buried deep in the soil of personality, pride, and the grinding pressures of coalition warfare. Bernard Montgomery was not a man given to self-doubt or diplomatic subtlety. The hero of El Alamein, the methodical victor who had driven Rommel from North Africa, Montgomery viewed warfare as a science requiring precision, planning, and professional mastery. He had transformed the British Eighth Army from a demoralized force into a victorious one, and in that transformation, he had also transformed his own self-image into something approaching the messianic. To Montgomery, the American way of war, characterized by what he perceived as improvisation, logistical brute force, and a casual approach to military doctrine, represented everything that was wrong with Allied command structure. He did not merely disagree with American methods. He believed them to be fundamentally, dangerously incompetent. Throughout 1944, as the Allied armies pushed from Normandy toward the German frontier, Montgomery's private correspondence had grown increasingly caustic. In letters to Chief of the Imperial General Staff Alan Brooke, Montgomery did not mince words. The American generals, he wrote, lacked the strategic vision to command large-scale operations. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was in Montgomery's estimation a fine coordinator and diplomat, but utterly lacking in battlefield command experience. Bradley, Patton, Hodges, all of them, in Montgomery's private assessment, were competent division or corps commanders at best, hopelessly out of their depth when entrusted with armies. These were not casual observations offered in fleeting frustration. They were systematic, repeated judgments that Montgomery committed to paper again and again, building a documented case for a fundamental restructuring of Allied command that would place himself, and only himself, in operational control of all ground forces. The Americans, Montgomery believed, needed a guiding hand. They needed discipline. They needed, in effect, to be saved from themselves. When Montgomery criticized American soldiers as brave but useless without proper leadership, he was not engaging in simple prejudice. He genuinely believed it. In his mind, American troops possessed raw courage and material abundance, but lacked the professional military culture that centuries of British martial tradition had refined. They were enthusiastic amateurs in a professional's war, and their generals were sending them to die because those generals did not understand the art of war as Montgomery understood it. It was not hatred that motivated these assessments. It was something far more dangerous. It was sincere conviction wrapped in the armor of professional arrogance. But Montgomery's campaign to reshape Allied command was more than mere critique. It was active politicking. He lobbied relentlessly for the creation of a deputy ground commander position, a role that everyone understood would belong to him and would effectively subordinate American generals to British oversight. He argued his case to Churchill, to Brooke, to anyone who would listen. The strategic rationale was always the same. Concentration of force under a single battlefield commander was militarily superior to Eisenhower's broad front strategy. The thrust should be narrow, British-led, aimed like a dagger toward the Ruhr. American forces would support this operation, naturally, providing their considerable logistical muscle, while British military genius provided the operational brain. What Montgomery failed to understand, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was the political dimension of coalition warfare. The Anglo-American alliance was not merely a military arrangement. It was a political necessity welded together by shared values, mutual interest, and the personal relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. By late 1944, the United States was providing the vast majority of men, equipment, and resources for the European campaign. American industrial might have turned the tide of the war. American soldiers were dying in their thousands in hedgerows, forests, and frozen fields. And Montgomery's suggestion that these men were led by incompetent generals who needed British supervision was not merely a strategic critique, it was a political hand grenade. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, striking at the weakest point in the American line and creating a dangerous bulge in the Allied front. The attack caught the Americans off guard. Entire divisions were surrounded. Communications broke down. The situation was chaotic, desperate, and terrifying. In the confusion, Eisenhower made a pragmatic decision. He temporarily transferred command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery, whose 21st Army Group was positioned on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. It was a sensible battlefield decision based on geography and communications. The American armies in the north had been cut off from Bradley's headquarters, and Montgomery could coordinate them more effectively. But it was also a decision pregnant with symbolism, and Montgomery seized upon it with both hands. To Montgomery, the Battle of the Bulge was vindication. Here was the proof that American command arrangements were inadequate. Here was the crisis that demonstrated the necessity of British leadership. When Montgomery took command of those American armies, he did so with the confidence of a man who believed history had finally proven him right. He worked tirelessly, stabilizing the line, organizing reserves, coordinating counterattacks. American soldiers under his temporary command fought with extraordinary courage, holding Bastogne, blunting the German advance, turning Hitler's last great gamble into a catastrophic failure. Montgomery's tactical contributions during this period were real and valuable, but Montgomery's perception of these contributions was something else entirely. In his mind, he had not merely coordinated a successful defense, he had saved the Americans from disaster. And on January 7, 1945, he decided to share that perception with the world. The press conference was supposed to be reassuring. Eisenhower, Brooke, and even Churchill had approved Montgomery giving a briefing to explain the command changes and praised the American soldiers who had borne the brunt of the fighting. Montgomery spoke glowingly of American troops, of their courage under fire, of their resilience in the face of adversity. He praised Eisenhower's leadership. He used all the right words. But the overall impression he left was unmistakable. Montgomery had arrived, taken charge, steadied the situation, and organized the victory. The subtext was clear to every reporter in that room. The British Field Marshal had rescued the Americans from their own mistakes. The American press reaction was immediate and volcanic. Headlines screamed across the United States, "Montgomery leads Yanks. British general takes credit for American battle." The narrative that emerged was one of British condescension and credit stealing. American commanders were furious. Bradley, whose forces had actually done the majority of the fighting, felt personally humiliated. Patton was characteristically profane in his assessment of Montgomery's performance. Even Eisenhower, normally the epitome of diplomatic restraint, was privately outraged. The alliance that had held together through years of combat, compromise, and shared sacrifice was suddenly, genuinely, in danger of fracturing. And in London, Winston Churchill read the reports with mounting alarm. Churchill understood something that Montgomery either could not or would not grasp. The Anglo-American alliance was the foundation upon which Allied victory rested, and that foundation was more fragile than it appeared. Britain was exhausted. The empire was overstretched, its manpower reserves depleted, its economy sustained by American loans and lend-lease. The strategic balance of power within the alliance had shifted decisively in America's favor. The United States was now the senior partner, and while Churchill maintained enormous personal influence through his relationship with Roosevelt, that influence depended on American goodwill. Montgomery's press conference threatened to poison that goodwill at precisely the moment when the war's endgame was being shaped. Churchill had defended Montgomery many times before. He admired the Field Marshal's military abilities and had personally supported him through controversies and setbacks. But this was different. This was not a matter of military judgment or tactical debate. This was an existential threat to the alliance. Churchill recognized immediately that if Montgomery's version of events, the narrative of British genius rescuing American incompetence, took hold in the public consciousness, the political consequences would be catastrophic. American public opinion would turn against continued cooperation with Britain. The careful diplomatic work of years would unravel. The post-war order that Churchill envisioned, with Britain and America standing together as custodians of Western civilization, would collapse before it could even be born. Churchill's response was swift and decisive. On January 18, 1945, 11 days after Montgomery's press conference, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to deliver an address on the war situation. Parliament was expecting a routine update. What they received instead was something far more significant, a public corrective to Montgomery's narrative, delivered by the Prime Minister himself, carefully calibrated to repair the damage without openly humiliating a British military hero. Churchill began his speech by discussing various theaters of war: Italy, Yugoslavia, Greece. He spoke of Britain's responsibilities, of the government's principles, of the complex challenges facing Allied forces across multiple fronts. He was building towards something, allowing the tension to gather, giving his audience time to sense that something important was coming. And then, after discussing the Greek situation at length, he turned to the subject that everyone knew was the real purpose of his address. He spoke of the Battle of the Bulge carefully, precisely, choosing every word with the skill of a master craftsman. "Care must be taken," Churchill declared, his voice carrying across the chamber, "in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." The words landed like artillery shells. Churchill was not merely praising American troops. He was explicitly, publicly, reframing the entire narrative that Montgomery had constructed. This was not a battle where British leadership saved American forces. This was an American battle, an American victory, the greatest American battle of the war. Churchill continued, emphasizing that the United States troops had done almost all the fighting. He detailed the American casualties, the American divisions engaged, the American resilience and courage. He was systematically dismantling Montgomery's implied narrative of British supremacy, replacing it with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of American predominance. But Churchill went further. In private communications to Montgomery, messages that would later emerge from the archives, Churchill's language was even more pointed. He explained to the Field Marshal that his press conference had caused grave concern and had created a dangerous situation within the alliance. Churchill did not explicitly accuse Montgomery of dishonesty or arrogance. Instead, he employed the devastating technique of treating Montgomery as someone who had unintentionally caused a problem through lack of awareness. The subtext was clear. Montgomery's behavior was not merely inappropriate. It was dangerous to Britain's strategic interests. Churchill made Montgomery understand that his campaign to secure supreme ground command and his pattern of criticizing American leadership had to end, not because he was wrong in his military assessments, but because he was destroying something more important than any battlefield victory: the political cohesion that made battlefield victory possible. For Churchill, this was not primarily about defending American feelings or engaging in diplomatic niceties. It was about cold strategic calculation. Britain needed America. Britain needed American troops, American factories, American resources, and American commitment to the post-war order. The era of British predominance was ending. The American century was beginning. Churchill saw this with painful clarity. Montgomery's inability or unwillingness to accept this new reality threatened to isolate Britain at the very moment when Britain most needed American partnership. By publicly correcting Montgomery's narrative and forcefully asserting the primacy of the American contribution to victory in the Bulge, Churchill was not merely being diplomatic. He was securing Britain's future. The symbolism of Churchill's intervention extended beyond the immediate crisis. In that House of Commons speech, Churchill was demonstrating a fundamental principle of leadership that Montgomery had never fully grasped: that successful coalition warfare requires subordinating personal pride and professional conviction to the larger political necessities that make coalition possible. Montgomery believed that military merit should determine command arrangements. Churchill understood that power, politics, and national interests determined command arrangements, and that military merit had to operate within those constraints. Montgomery wanted to reshape the alliance to match his vision of proper military organization. Churchill recognized that the alliance's political foundation was more important than any particular military structure, and that foundation had to be protected, even if it meant constraining the ambitions of Britain's most successful field commander. The American reaction to Churchill's speech was profound relief. The U.S. press, which had been increasingly critical of British intentions, softened its tone. American military leaders who had been discussing with Eisenhower whether Montgomery could continue to serve in a command position stepped back from the brink. The crisis passed. The alliance held. And Montgomery, while he never fully accepted the rebuke, was forced to moderate his public behavior. The campaign for a deputy ground commander position quietly died. The private letters criticizing American leadership became less frequent, more circumspect. But the episode left lasting scars. The Anglo-American military relationship, never as smooth as wartime propaganda suggested, bore the permanent marks of Montgomery's overreach and the crisis it provoked. American commanders never fully trusted Montgomery again. Bradley and Patton actively worked to limit his role in subsequent operations. When the final campaigns of the war were planned, the crossing of the Rhine, the drive into Germany, the occupation zones, American leaders ensured that American forces would have the predominant role and that Montgomery's influence would be contained. The political cost of Montgomery's arrogance was measured not just in wounded feelings, but in the operational marginalization of British forces during the war's final months. For Churchill, the intervention represented both a triumph and a tragedy. He had saved the alliance, demonstrated his continued value as a diplomatic leader, and preserved Britain's relationship with its essential partner. But he had also been forced to publicly diminish a British military hero's accomplishments, to explicitly acknowledge American predominance, and to accept the reality that Britain's voice in Allied councils was increasingly dependent on American sufferance rather than British power. The Battle of the Bulge controversy was a microcosm of the larger transition taking place: the passing of British imperial dominance and the rise of American superpower status. What remains most striking about this episode is not Montgomery's misjudgment or Churchill's diplomatic skill, but rather the fundamental tension it revealed between military professionalism and political necessity. Montgomery was not entirely wrong in his military critiques. Eisenhower was not a battlefield commander of Montgomery's experience. American operational methods did differ significantly from British doctrine. The broad front strategy could be legitimately questioned on military grounds, but Montgomery's essential error was his inability to recognize that these questions existed within a political context that made his preferred solutions impossible. He wanted to win the war according to proper military principles. Churchill understood that the war had to be won in a way that preserved the political relationships that would shape the peace. The alliance survived because Churchill intervened, but the fact that such intervention was necessary revealed how precarious the foundation of coalition warfare truly was, how easily personal ambition, national pride, and professional conviction could threaten strategic partnerships. Montgomery had called American soldiers brave but useless, without proper leadership. Churchill's response was to declare their battle the greatest American victory of the war. In the gap between those two statements lay the entire complex, difficult, necessary reality of coalition warfare. The recognition that winning together required more than military competence. It required the wisdom to know when military judgment must bow to political necessity, and the courage to defend that necessity even against your own nation's heroes. As the winter of 1945 gave way to spring, and as Allied armies advanced across the Rhine toward final victory, the lessons of the Bulge controversy faded into the background of more immediate operational concerns. Montgomery continued to command. American forces continued to advance. The alliance held. But in the private correspondence of Allied leaders, in the careful phrasing of operational orders, in the political calculations that shaped post-war planning, the memory of that January crisis lingered, a reminder that the alliance had come closer to breaking than the public ever knew, and that it had been preserved not by military genius or strategic brilliance, but by Winston Churchill's clear-eyed recognition that power was shifting, that Britain's role was changing, and that acknowledging American predominance was the price of remaining relevant in the world that victory would create. Do like, comment, and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe Generals of World War II for more interesting stories.